Hello everyone, we are today joined by Dr. Georg Löfflmann, and he wrote his PhD thesis on Obama and his grand strategy, and of course he followed on US strategy in general. So what in your study or view is the role of Germany in US strategy overall?
Okay, so maybe we should start by saying what American grand strategy is, or what grand strategy is first of all.
Yeah.
Grand strategy is this idea that a country has an overarching vision of its role in the world, in particular in terms of how does it pursue national security for itself. And the idea is that we're having an equation of means and ends. So let's say national security is the end, and the means are then the economic and military resources and the diplomatic influence at the disposal of a state. And so I combine all of these resources, ideally in a coherent and consistent fashion, to reach my desired end state. The textbook example would be containment during the Cold War, right, where American and Western grand strategy was to halt the expansion of Soviet power through military, diplomatic, and economic means throughout the Cold War. Now, when we think about American grand strategy nowadays, it is essentially subsumed under this idea of liberal hegemony. The United States acts as the leader of the free world. It acts as a leader of the liberal international system. And American economic and military power essentially sustains a global system of alliances and partnerships that ultimately serves to maintain great power peace and deter regional aggression, to maintain an open economic system, right? So freedom of the sea, support for free trade, and also the United States takes an active leadership role in the management of global issues such as combating climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, counterterrorism, for example. And within this system, the United States has essentially three regions of primary strategic interest. That is Europe, Middle East, and East Asia, or the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific. And of course, American grand strategy under Obama was essentially undertaking a reassessment that said that the United States is overcommitted in the Middle East with the war on terror, but the center of gravity in terms of geoeconomics, in terms of geopolitics, is shifting to the east, it's shifting to the Asia-Pacific because of this enormous economic growth of China, and with that, this enormous growth of Chinese military capabilities, modernization of the Chinese armed forces, the growth of the Chinese Navy, China claiming up to 80% of the South China Sea, right? Militarizing these archipelagos and creating artificial islands, Scarborough Shoal Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, near the Philippines and near Vietnam. And so this idea was that the United States really needs to invest more into the Asia-Pacific, right? For example, from 2020 onwards, has 60% of the U.S. Navy stationed in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. And so Germany, of course, is seen in the United States as its most important European ally, or most important continental European ally. Obviously, the United States has a special relationship with the United Kingdom, which means that cooperation in military intelligence matters is probably the closest with the UK, and oftentimes it is the UK, which is the most significant partner in terms of, for example, when we think about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But when we think about the EU, when we think about the European continent, then Germany is the most important partner for the United States. And the United States has essentially begged Germany for, 15 years to invest more in its military, to shoulder more of a burden for the defense of NATO, to finally, reach the 2% target of NATO expenditure, 2% target of GDP for defense expenditures. And they pretty much have fallen on deaf ears under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration. And of course, the United States was also very critical of Nord Stream one and two, these energy pipelines, this energy dependency on Russia, and particularly in the Trump administration, Germany essentially laughed these concerns off by essentially saying that, the United States just wants to pursue its own interest in selling its fracking gas. And of course, there is also economic self-interest in some of these arguments. But by and large, the United States sees Russia as a revisionist power who wants to use force to, redraw borders and essentially at least partially revise the post-Cold War international order and post-Cold War security order in Europe. And these concerns were not really taken seriously in Germany. And now I think very much the hope in Washington is that Germany will make good on its Zeitenwende promises, that it will invest the means, that the Bundeswehr is a credible force again, that Germany will play a similar role that it played in particular in the 70s and 1980s, that the Bundeswehr would be the conventional backbone of NATO and, shoulder a lot of the responsibilities for deterrence of Russia in Eastern Europe, allowing the United States to prioritize the Indo-Pacific and deterrence of China, and in particular also deterrence of China in terms of aspirations for Taiwan, where under Xi Jinping, China might be tempted to use force to forcefully reunify, in their terminology, Taiwan with mainland China. So I think the idea would be a bit of like a Batman and Robin kind of situation, where Germany is the Robin in Europe to America's Batman. And I think in particular, when we look to Scholz and Biden, they seem to have a quite close and quite good working relationship. They share some or many of the same concerns. On the issue of tanks, for example, neither one has so far, moved on sending either Abrams or, Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And so I think in many ways, the United States sees Germany as a like-minded power, firmly rooted in, the liberal international order, a stalwart liberal democracy, a country who shares America's own preference for free trade, for example, economic openness, a less state interventionist economy than France, for example. But of course, we also can't ignore the domestic political situation in the United States. We have a Republican Party that under Trump tilted more toward an America First stand. Trump was hostile toward this entire idea of the liberal international order. Trump called NATO obsolete. He announced a drawdown of U.S. troops from Germany, essentially to punish Angela Merkel in Germany for what he considered, the predatory economic behavior by Germany, who, according to Trump, ripped off the United States, and he slapped punitive tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum from the EU and Canada and China, for example. So Angela Merkel reacted to this by saying that the times where we can completely rely on others, they are partially over. And I think this is a very important point. The United States and American taxpayers will not indefinitely, be ready and willing to essentially foot the bill for the defense of very wealthy European countries with very generous social welfare, states, but that keep underinvesting in their own defense, with defense budget in the past of Germany, 1.2, 1.5, 1.6% of GDP. And, if I was a farmer in Iowa or, working at GM in Detroit, or, in a store in Georgia, then I would also ask, why is our taxpayer money going to, to these kind of, causes? And Trump, of course, mobilizes nationalist populist sentiment very effectively. So the best investment that the Europeans can do, and Germany can do in particular, is really make good on the 2% pledge, saying that they're serious about burden sharing, because this is also a way to keep the Americans in, right? As Lord Ismay said, the point of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Americans in, and the Russians out. I think the point is not so much to keep the Germans down anymore, but rather to have the Germans take more of a role. But definitely you still want to keep the Russians out and the Americans in. And so Germany, I think, should accept that leadership role that the United States very much wants it to assume, and act more in partnership with the United States, particularly in security and defense matters.
Now, what I've recently looked, when I just look at the main battle tank market, let's see, Poland invested heavily. So they have Leopard 2 tanks, they got now Korean K2 tanks, and they also got M1 Abrams. So could it be that Poland wants basically to take over the role in Europe to be the first partner for the United States? And is it really a competition for Germany? Or how is this seen by the US? Or is it maybe even instrumentalized in a certain way? So like, okay, Poland, you look at Poland and now do your part Germany, or is there something which we can tell?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the Polish government has announced like a very heavy investment, particularly into the Polish ground forces, right? And so when we see about like, 1,000 or how many K2 things they're ordering and hundreds of artillery systems, then they're definitely beefing up Poland into the sort of like conventional backbone, if you will, in terms of a deterrence that the Bundeswehr used to be when it fielded 12 army divisions with 36 brigades and like thousands of Leopard tanks and in the 1980s. So this is not the force that Germany will go back to, but I also don't think it is the force that Germany needs, because I think when we look to, Germany, it is still in certain ways, a full spectrum military, right? The Luftwaffe has, modern Eurofighters, A400M transport planes. Now it acquires the F-35. The German Navy is the largest navy in the Baltic Sea with, the German corvettes. Germany has capable frigates with the F-126 on order. So I would argue that when we look to the full spectrum of military capabilities, Poland absolutely is going to be a credible military force. But when we look to more than just the army, when we look sort of to the wider picture, also when we look cyber capabilities and so forth, then I would argue that Germany will, if not have the biggest army, it should, after a successful Zeitenwende, and if it really invests 2% or even more than 2%, just by the sheer size of the German economy, Germany should have one of the most capable and most modern armed forces in NATO, which will then allow it to, simultaneously engage in deterrence operations and deployments in, for example, Lithuania, in Slovakia, but also to engage in, the slew of missions that are still, part and parcel of Germany's security profile, like anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, let's say, weapons embargo off the coast of Lebanon, training and advise and assist missions for the EU, like in Mali, for example, UN peacekeeping operations. All of this will not go away. So while Germany is reorienting towards territorial defense and deterrence, at the same time, it is also this kind of full spectrum force, and because of its political clout and diplomatic role, it will also still need to be able to engage with these other roles. Also, for example, a growing role of Germany in the Indo-Pacific, right? We had the frigate Bavaria, the frigate Bayern was on a tour of the Asia-Pacific. The Luftwaffe just had a deployment training, for example, with like-minded democratic allies in the region, like Australia, like Japan. I think the German army, the Heer, will send some units next. So, while of course German power projection is quite limited and nowhere near the United States, and it also doesn't have the capabilities like France and the UK with an aircraft carrier, there is a growing awareness that Germany also will need to play its part, for example, in maintaining this liberal international order, not just in Europe, but also in the Asia-Pacific, and there to link up with the US and other partners. So I think, we are seeing some signs that there is a more grown-up, more serious strategic role in development for Germany. But of course, that will take find a lot of financial resources. And Germany will recognize that a peace dividend is definitely over of the last 20 years, and that it will need to get used to investing into its own defense to not only maintain security in Europe, but also to maintain the alliances and the partnerships that itself has benefited and profited from for decades during the Cold War and then in the period after reunification. So I think going forward, we're looking at something more like 2 to 3% of GDP for defense expenditures in Germany by Germany. So I think we need to get used to defense budgets in Germany between, like, let's say 70 and 100 billion euros. And I think this is still going to be a difficult process. This is also going to be something that will take a difficult adjustment in terms of the constitutionality of the German debt brake and how that can be reconciled. But I think this is without alternative, because Germany is simply too big in order to still keep not fulfilling its promises, whether it is within NATO or whether it is within the EU. And in particular, if Germany wants to keep the United States on board as, its preferred strategic partner in Europe, then it will also need to show the Americans that, we are putting our money where our mouth is.
If you look forward, one could say that probably in the future that, or already happening, that Poland basically will secure the eastern flank of the European Union with ground forces. And we should mention here, tanks are rather cheap compared to airplanes, whereas Germany will be somewhere in between with providing more navy and more air force capabilities, probably. That would make sense.
I mean, it's a mix, right? I mean, Germany will obviously have naval capabilities, air force capabilities, but also in Lithuania we have one, battalion on a rotational basis. We have one brigade that is pledged by Germany to Lithuania, and we're having an entire division made out of 3 brigades combining heavy and medium forces that is supposed to be combat ready by 2025. So kind of like so Germany will play its part as the NATO Feuerwehr or the NATO Fire Brigade. So if there is, a conflagration, if there is a crisis, then Germany will be sort of in that second echelon and will be able to dispatch troops quite quickly in a matter of days in, for example, going into Lithuania. And this is also, I think, the speed of deployment is now something where we are seeing a development more toward wheeled systems, both in terms of artillery systems and in terms of German Jäger units, German infantry units switching from the Wieseltankette to those new heavy Boxer systems. So we're not going to get back the 1980s Bundeswehr with thousands of Leopard, but we're going to have a mix of German heavy and medium units in particular as part of NATO reassurance and NATO deterrence in the East.
Is there also a focus on air deployment, basically? Because for me, what was interesting for the Cold War, there were 12 divisions, and one of them was a Fallschirmjäger division, a parachute division. It was parachute, not air landing. And for me, I was quite shocked actually that so many troops were assigned to the paratroopers. And is there something on those lines planned, or is it just basically armed, tracked and wheeled?
No, there is also going to be a light formation. So I think Germany still has one Fallschirmjäger brigade, so one airborne brigade, which I think is to be maintained. I think there's actually going to be a slight increase in the troops there. Germany also still has a mountain infantry brigade. So we also still are seeing these light infantry formations, and of course, as we're also seeing in Ukraine, these units absolutely also still have their value. I'm also thinking that by and large, Germany is moving in the right direction if it actually can really have these 3 army divisions, a light one and 2 sort of like with a heavy and medium mix, because it will allow it to respond to all kinds of contingencies. I mean, Germany's airborne forces, for example, are also there to cooperate with German special forces, right? Evacuation operations, for example, of German and EU and Western citizens abroad. The Kabul scenario of August 2021, for example. So as I said, Germany has the ambition to have a full spectrum force, and now it is about putting in both the structures and the equipment levels and the financial resources in order to actually realize such a force.
And reduce the bureaucracy. Probably the most important stuff.
And hopefully I'll cut back on the bureaucracy as well.
Because if there's a constant complaint I hear from everyone and everywhere, it's too much bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think there might also be something where, does every backpack that is being ordered for the armed forces need like a 75-page, mission profile and like a month-long, testing phase, or can't they just like buy a backpack that's already on the market, for example?
Of course. So thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.